Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having us here today. Normally, we spend our Thursday mornings in drafty old government offices on the other side of London in Westminster. So having an opportunity to speak at Black Hat is far more interesting and a real privilege. I'm Elizabeth Davis, and my colleague Ben Walden and I work for the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. So for those of you who are not from the UK, that's our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Within the FCDO, our team leads on the UK's policy approach to what we call commercial cyber proliferation and an international initiative called the Pall Mall process. So this morning, Ben and I will set out between us what we mean when we're talking about commercial cyber proliferation, what we're worried about and why, how the UK government is approaching tackling the issue, and how you can get involved. You might be wondering why the UK's Foreign Office is up here on a stage in London talking to you. So I should reassure you that our work on the issue involves all parts of the UK government, including the actual technical experts at the National Cybersecurity Centre, or NCSC, which is the UK's National Technical Authority for Cybersecurity. And much of what I say this morning will draw on their hard work. So first of all, definitions. What do we mean when we say proliferation of commercial cyber intrusion capability? In the scope of this work are 1, hacking as a service companies, so companies providing end-to-end products like commercial spyware. 2, the vulnerability and exploit marketplace. 3, hackers for hire groups providing top-end intrusion services for corporate and state espionage. And 4, the misuse of end-to-end modular tools like commercial tool frameworks. These do all have legitimate uses around the world. We want to be clear about that, not least for testing security, as well as some national security and law enforcement requirements. But we know that they are also misused. And overall, the growth of this market lowers the barrier to entry to an increasing range of cyber threat actors, increases the volume and variety of threats we face, and threatens government officials, critical infrastructure, businesses, and citizens. The NCSC's headline assessment, reiterated in their annual review published last week, is pretty bleak. Increased demand for cyber intrusion capability, coupled with a permissive operating environment, will almost certainly drive an increased threat to a wide range of sectors, including from less predictable types of threat actor over the next 5 years. This expansion, without interventions, will be transformational to cyber threat. So how did the NCSC arrive at this judgment? It isn't straightforward. The commercial market in these advanced capabilities upends the traditional threat models because threat actors aren't developing their own capability, they're buying it or appropriating it. When a developer or broker sells a capability, often through several resellers, who holds the responsibility for how it is then used? The end user, the initial researcher, the commercial investor, or everyone in between? And at what point does activity in this value chain become a threat? It's complicated. The impact on cyber threat is a combination of who has access to the capability, so who is using it and why. What does that capability enable? So is it a transformational increase in capability or just a minimal uplift? And the barriers to entry, the potential scale of access. So how wide is its customer base? The highest impact is proliferation to threat actors with high intent to cause harm, who would not otherwise be able to pose a threat. And the threat from a specific commercial entity, like a company operating in this market, is the intent and capability to enable that proliferation. By intent, that includes an absence of adequate safeguards on development, sale, and misuse. Many in the sector operate in accordance with the norms of responsible cyber behavior, but as we all know, many do not. A small number potentially do this intentionally, but many likely do so unintentionally because the market lacks transparency and common standards. The lack of oversight and opportunities for significant profit currently encourage business models of selling to as many customers as possible, with limited vetting or technical safeguards. There is currently limited incentive to be responsible when it comes to proliferation of transformational capability, and few tools to support doing so. I have young children, so allow me to tell you a story. I'm hoping many of you are familiar with the story of Goldilocks and the 3 bears. The little girl, Goldilocks, secretly goes into the woods and, just as she's hungry, comes across a cottage with the door open. On the table there are 3 bowls of porridge, 1 too hot, 1 too cold, and 1 just right, which she finishes. It turns out the porridge belongs to 3 bears who come home to discover what Goldilocks has done and chase her off. In a similar way to perceptions of the cyber intrusion market, there were multiple interpretations of this story. Was Goldilocks a brave explorer who pushed boundaries to get what she needed? Was she a criminal who should respect private property? Were the bears innocent enablers by providing the porridge and leaving the door open? Or was it their responsibility to be more careful? Should Goldilocks have eaten the porridge when she had no way of knowing who made it, or, frankly, what was actually in it? That is just a bedtime story with limited consequences, and it is, after all, just about porridge. But what we are talking about today is a trade in transformational capability that can be used to cause real harm to victims around the world. Commercial spyware has already been used against civil society globally and at scale. On the current trajectory of proliferation, we are almost certain to continue to see high-profile examples of compromises of victims that are neither necessary nor proportionate on the basis of national security or law enforcement. While the UK government's current assessment view is that cybercrime groups are not big customers of the exploit market, we are already seeing these groups make use of zero-day capability for ransomware operations. The opaque way the market operates makes access easier, raising the potential for high-impact disruption to our businesses, government, and critical infrastructure. Securing capability so it isn't stolen or leaked is also important. There is a real risk of unintentional proliferation here, and this is not the sort of capability that any one of us would want to see in the hands of non-state actors. The growing availability of hacker-for-hire services to anyone willing to pay widens access to cyber operations to a broad range of actors with different motivations: insider trading, corporate espionage, intelligence gathering, political disinformation, organized crime, disruption, or destruction. Sometimes hackers for hire work tightly to state customer requirements, but they also operate opportunistically. And with profit driving victim selection, the risk of unintended consequences is high. So just like Goldilocks, the line between legitimate and criminal activity is unhelpfully blurred. From the UK government's perspective, the accessibility of transformational capability increases the threat. And, in the absence of sufficient checks and balances, makes the whole world we live in less safe and more unpredictable for everyone and anyone. And the threat implications are set to get worse. We expect to see diversification in what is being developed and sold, exploitation of a greater range of access vectors, and, of course, access to AI-enabled cyber capability. So the obvious next question is, well, what is good and what is bad? But unfortunately, just as in the Goldilocks story, it's not that simple. Context matters, intent matters, capability matters, standards matter, and consistency matters. The ambiguity and opaqueness of this market makes it difficult for governments worldwide, both because we're not effectively mitigating the threat that truly irresponsible actors create, and because it's more difficult for us as governments to work with the market as a customer where we need to, in a responsible way. The latter point there is really important. We want to see the intrusion sector work better for security, society, and the market itself, to reduce the impact on the threat to us all. And we need to ensure that we don't inadvertently have a negative impact on the cybersecurity industry while we do so. So imagine a scenario where Goldilocks and the three bears talk to each other and identify solutions that are not too hot, not too cold, but just right. And in fact, in some versions of the story, the bears and Goldilocks do in fact do this, and there's a better ending for everyone. So on that note, I will hand over to Ben to say a little more about the Pall Mall process.
Thanks so much, Liz. So in the Foreign Office, Liz and I sit in a team which is called Emerging Cyber Threats. And basically what we're worried about are states, and you'll excuse me because we're policy people, we're not technical, bashing the UK with bad cyber. And so in particular, we're worried about the way in which the commercial market is bringing really advanced, nasty, bad cyber to actors that previously wouldn't have the capability to do so, as Liz has laid out. As a result, we have been leading on this approach that the UK has launched recently with France called the Pall Mall process, through which we're trying to directly address this problem head on. The Pall Mall process is basically at the centre of the UK's approach to this. This is a global market and it needs a global solution. And that's why we're here talking to all of you today to hopefully get some of you involved. If we're being honest, as governments, we've obviously been engaging with the cyber intrusion marketplace for quite some time. This includes potentially working with some of you in the audience today. So We're thinking about kind of our intelligence community and the way in which they work with the vulnerability and exploit marketplace. We're thinking about law enforcement, seeking out tools for digital forensics and the like. And we're also talking about the incredibly important work that goes on with penetration testing and stuff like that. But in the wake of the growth of the market in the last 10 years or so, the way in which we think about it has started to change quite dramatically, particularly in the rise of what Liz set out earlier with the spyware as a service models. Increasingly, we're seeing that these capabilities are being quite severely misused, which is in turn increasing the volume, the variety, and the severity of all the threats that we're facing here in the UK, the bad cyber that Liz and I have to worry about. And this problem is going to get worse. The market's growing really fast, and the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK thinks that it's going to double in size by about 2030, and then keep on an upward trajectory after that, unless something is done to try and kind of control the curve a little bit. The lack of transparency, accountability, and oversight that exist across the market basically make it really hard for us as governments to engage with it or to understand what the hell is going on, and that in turn makes it hard to do anything about it. It's also increasingly difficult to think about the market as independent parts, but rather kind of one holistic whole. The same organizations that are involved in vulnerability research might also be selling end-to-end capabilities with significant impact, potentially even in the illegal space. And what that means is our approach to the market needs to be ultimately really consistent. That's really important for you as companies and for us as governments, so that we understand what our approach is doing and the parts of the market that we're not trying to hit. So far, though, there hasn't been any single articulation of what sorts of cyber intrusion activity are okay or should be encouraged, and what parts shouldn't. This is bad for the market and potentially some of you, because it's difficult to know what you can and can't do without being penalised. But it's also really bad for governments because it means we have no handle on the situation. And it also makes it harder for us to work with the market in a truly responsible way. So, what we want to do about it. Basically, we want to figure out a way to think about the future of the market and how we can shape it. This is a really difficult thing to do because, as Liz laid out, ultimately the market is really opaque. It's difficult to understand what's going on, and much of it operates primarily off trust and secrecy. In order to do so, basically we need to bring together a load of different organizations. We need to bring together states as both regulators and customers for the market. We need to bring together different parts of industry, the vulnerability researchers, the brokers, the end-to-end vendors, and everything that exists in between and around that. And we also need to bring together the threats researchers who have played such a key role in helping us to understand what this market is, where it presents a threat, and how that's changing. By setting guidelines, hopefully, we can allow for companies to operate more freely in the knowledge their activity isn't going to be bashed by the UK, which can make the whole thing work more efficiently. What we want to achieve through building international and multi-stakeholder consensus is essentially three things. We want access to the most advanced capabilities to be controlled and limited. We want international norms and safeguards to play some sort of role in encouraging the responsible development, sale and use of these capabilities. And most importantly of all, we want to improve the transparency of the market in order to make it easier for vendors working within it and for governments looking at it to understand what the hell is going on. So, that's the idea. We started the Pall Mall process back in February, bringing together a series of organisations and states and everything else to agree on the fact that there was a problem. Now we need to do something about it. Over the next year, first we have to grow the group of Pall Mall signatories. We've got about 60 so far, but we're really keen to involve any and all industry organisations that would have an interest in it. And we need to begin thinking with that group what it is that we can actually take forward as actions together, building a model for shared responsibility. To kick off that process, over the last 3 to 4 months or so, we've launched a consultation, basically asking everyone what they think good practices for different sort of actors should look like. In total, we've had about 73 responses from a whole swathe of different companies, including some quite renowned ones that you'll have all have heard of in this space. And we got a whole host of recommendations, some of which were fantastic, some of which, if we're being honest, were a bit terrible. But we thought we'd share some of what those recommendations involved today. For governments, respondents were really clear that ultimately, the way in which governments can set direction is by setting clear standards for regulating our own law enforcement and intelligence capabilities, defining what legitimate use of commercial cyber intrusion tools and services looks like, and establishing some form of independent oversight so it's not just the watchers watching the watchers. We need to reconsider our approach to export controls regimes. There's a question as to whether or not various different export control regimes, including the Wassenaar arrangement, contain adequate controls over cyber intrusion technologies. But at the same time, we don't want to interfere with legitimate cyber intrusion activity like penetration testing. Instead, what we might look to do is improve the guidance we provide around export controls and how we enforce them so we can be really clear for companies in the UK and elsewhere where their activity might be subject to export control and where not. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, government's a major customer for this market. And in doing so, we can leverage our procurement power to help influence the market in a way that we might want it to go in. We can tell the companies that we're working with, we won't work with you unless you're willing to behave clearly, improve your supply chain transparency, etc. We can also use that as a way to debar bad actors so we're not in turn supporting them in kind. There is a point there about going after bad actors. The US, through various policy levers they've used, has chosen to entity list and financially sanction a number of organizations accused of irresponsible activity across this market. And this is something that other states can look at too. And finally, we all need to work together as states. So the UK has a view on this market, France has a view on this market, the US has a view on this market, but so does every other state across the world. They're all engaging with it, they're all thinking about it. And so we need to be clear that we can share information about kind of where we understand the opportunities, but more importantly, the risks to be about engaging with it and regulating the market. And we also need to make sure that our approach to the market is harmonized, so we're not favoring certain jurisdictions over others. There are also a series of recommendations for companies, those operating kind of in and around the market. And they vary quite dramatically, actually, with some companies saying that everything was fine and the market should be allowed to keep going as it is, and others really pushing for self-regulation. Ultimately, the kind of four key things that came to mind through the results we got were that publishing some sort of process as to how you manage your relationship in the market is really important. If you're saying you're working responsibly, it's much easier for others to hold you account for that responsible behavior or your failure to meet it. There's something in there about know your customer requirements. When commercial entities sell to customers, in some markets they have to do appropriate due diligence to make sure that they're not accidentally supporting criminality or bad behavior. And that same sort of responsibility could be put on organizations working within the cyber intrusion marketplace. There's a question around how we manage vulnerabilities and the exploit chains that can be built off the back of them. So clearly there's a really important role here for vulnerability disclosure programs and bug bounties in trying to encourage the vulnerability research community in part to go towards responsible vulnerability disclosure. But then there's also a question around the companies that actually operate with exploits, how they manage them, how they control them and make sure that they're not being stolen or misused. Finally, there's the supply chain question. How do you as a company work with your supply chain to make sure that you're not accidentally supporting or buying from companies that are working with dodgy customers, and to improve the transparency to make it easier for your customers to understand who in turn you are operating with. That's a difficult thing to achieve, but there are technical and legal mechanisms to begin to try and enforce it for certain parts of the supply chain. Ultimately, though, what really came out of the consultation was this is all a question of incentives. It's really, really profitable to work within the cyber intrusion marketplace if you're willing to work with bad people. And what we need to do is try and tip those scales somewhere. We need to kind of, as governments, incentivize responsible behavior and make sure we're really disincentivizing the sorts of behavior we don't want to see. There's also a question about policy consistency. At the moment, within the UK government, we have just finished going through a kind of massive audit of the different ways in which we interact with this market as a regulator and customer. And what we found is that ultimately we're pretty inconsistent. And that's really punishing to industry in a way it shouldn't be. And so there's a huge piece to be done kind of within the groups that are thinking about this, about how we can make sure we align our approaches in a way that allows the industry to thrive in a responsible way. So Liz and I have talked through a problem. The next step is agreeing collectively on how we solve it. The consultation process has given us some ideas, but now we need to actually get everyone to agree. And so that's exactly what we're trying to do over the next few months or so. We're having our next Pall Mall summit in April in Paris, 2025. And hopefully we'll see some of you there. If you'd like to be involved, I'll tell you how to in just a second. But ahead of that conference, we're going to be negotiating what we're calling a government code of practice. Essentially, a series of actions that governments can commit to taking that will, through the levers that we've described today, have some sort of influence on the commercial cyber intrusion marketplace. Thinking about the way in which governments procure, thinking about the way in which we use export controls, thinking about where particular bad actors need to have punitive action taken against them. Beyond that, we're looking at what the responsibility on industry should be in turn. So we'll have kind of two sides of the coin. We'll have the code of practice for governments, and we'll have the code of practice for industry. And what we're really aware of there is there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and so we'll need to work with different bits of the industry differently. Hopefully some of you in the audience today will be able to help us with some of that. In order to make that happen, we really need for all of the industry to be involved. And so if you would like to... Oh, I've just been buzzed. I think that might have been something falling. Sorry about that, guys. If you'd like to be involved, please approach Liz and I after the session, either to find out a little bit more about the work we're doing here in the UK, or how you can involve yourselves directly. We've also got a really sketchy QR code that we plonked government logo on top of to make it seem slightly more legit. Now, none of you should scan that because we're at a cybersecurity conference, but if you do, that should take you through to a link with a way in which you can sign up to get involved. Okay, guys, thanks so much for listening to Liz and I over the last 20 minutes or so. We've now got about 20 minutes for questions. So open to the floor. We'd be really keen to hear all of your thoughts, whether we're trying something that's really stupid and what we should be doing better. That man there. I don't know how we do questions. Do we have a mic for questions, or do you just have to shout?
Oh, I think that's one.
Oh, just there. Thanks very much. Liz, do you want to come up
Testing,
as well,
testing.
just in case you
Okay.
can answer it better than I can?
So as you mentioned, there's kind of a difficult asymmetry that you're working with here, and that oftentimes the actors that have the most ability or the most intention to create damage are also the ones that are willing to pay the most for these kinds of exploits. And given that a lot of these transactions can happen and do happen in a way that isn't something that can be subject to government regulation, is the goal of the Pall Mall process explicitly to work with actors that have some baseline level of good faith, that is like legally incorporated entities, people who are known white hat hackers, and that sort of thing? And is there any intention of this process to also expand their scope beyond this, or is it more just within the kind of recognized community of people who are doing this in a legitimate way?
It's a bit of both. So ultimately, you can't take steps to try and encourage responsible behavior across the market unless you are working with actors who are operating in good faith. But as you say, there's a really non-insubstantial part of the market that is notorious for acting irresponsibly and not really caring. And so at some level, we will have to reach out to those parts of the market and engage with them at some level. But what we're not doing is trying to create a certification scheme that can rubber stamp bad activity. And so we're going in with open eyes to the fact where we're talking to organizations or parts of the market that have operated badly in the past. They're not for certain going to operate better in the future unless we take specific action to force them to do so.
So in a sentence or two, could you describe how you see your approach to that trade-off and how broad you would like your enforcement to be versus how strict you want the regulations to be? As in, like, if you want to be able to enforce something that is relatively standardized and make sure that there's good conduct, then you probably need to decrease the scope of people that are involved. And so do you think that one is more important than the other, or how do you balance those two things against each other?
Really good question, because that's probably the hardest challenge we have with all of this work, right? And there's always going to be a kind of compromise between working with a group that can take forward positive action versus working with a large enough group to have a market moving change. Essentially, what we want to do is try and kind of increase the size of the responsible bit of the market. So kind of work with the bits of the market that we are confident are operating within acceptable thresholds. So, digital forensics is a perfectly legitimate use for these tools. In some level, spies will always spy, and so we need to kind of work with that in our minds. But at the same time, we need to kind of go after the bad actors. And so it's by increasing the space in which people can operate legitimately, not increasing the scope of what legitimate means, and responsibly, it then makes it easier for us to identify particularly bad actors and to go after them with harder policy levers like sanctions.
And do you see specific policy levers that you could say create incentives for less legitimate actors to become more legitimate over time? Are there things that you're currently doing or plan to do in the future?
So there's no silver bullet, but actually there is a whole kind of toolkit of incentives that we can use to kind of start to prod the market in this direction. I think one that we haven't talked about today, but is really, really important, is ultimately the money. Many organizations that operate within this space are venture capital backed or have significant private financing behind them. And if we can find a way to encourage private finance to go towards the bit of the market that we consider to be responsible and away from the bits of the market that we don't think to be responsible, that's a pretty good nudge in the right direction.
That's great. Thank you.
I think it's worth just adding to that. So that is obviously also what we're thinking about from a kind of UK government perspective. But obviously, when we think about the Pall Mall process, there are other states involved who all have a different range of levers at their disposal that they can use in a different way. And it's an additional challenge, but also an opportunity, right? In that we look, for example, at the contrast between the UK and the US, in that the US has the power of executive order and so has been able to take certain steps already. We don't have that in the UK because of the way our political system works. So some of this is also the challenge at looking at that toolkit and seeing what can be applied in different contexts, in different ways, kind of across that international picture.
Gentleman at the front.
Yes, I mean, you mentioned private investment, etc. But at the moment, are you looking at some form of arbitration about pricing? Because different sectors are prepared to pay radically different amounts of money for vulnerabilities. Obviously, telcos, etc., quite well paid. Car manufacturers have now learned to pay. Banks have always, nowadays. Government, we do have to say government is reluctant to pay, pays badly. And so the market is not performing well. And of course, someone who has a vulnerability, in terms of disclosing it to a particular target, they either basically tell them or they don't. And that discovering that price can be really hard. And what if they don't? And that, I mean, having built some critical national infrastructure, finding bugs is quite important, but actually working out their price is incredibly hard. So are you looking at some sort of arbitration mechanism for prices when important things are involved, or just as some sort of compliance requirement?
It's another really good and really tough question. I think kind of as a first step, what we're trying to do is improve the transparency of the market. So at the moment, it's very difficult to understand who's selling to who, what that kind of process looks like, and what prices they're using. There is anecdotal evidence of particular exploit chains being sold to one state for a particular amount of money and then another state for 20 times as much money. And so understanding kind of the pricing system when it comes to exploit chains selling for millions of pounds is very difficult to get into. But if we can try and enforce some level of transparency around kind of the way in which the market operates, it starts to make that whole process a lot easier. And then when it comes to the specific pricing, whether that's kind of from the UK government or other governments or different bits of government, I'm afraid that's not a Foreign Office thing that we're able to talk about, but it is something that is being considered as part of the process. In a way, there's kind of two separate approaches here. There's how can we build an international initiative and harmonise internationally, but then there's how can we as the UK government engage with the market more responsibly. And that's exactly the sort of advice that is, I think, really important for us as the UK as well.
Thank you.
Should we do? And then we'll come to you. There and there.
Thank you. Quick one, hopefully. You said at some point that the government can influence the market by, directly requesting from the suppliers to work or not one way or another. So I was curious if you could elaborate a bit on what's the inspiration to implement such market control, as in, have you seen it working and compared it in other domains? And what are the potential risks towards innovation in cybersecurity overall if such controls are introduced?
So the main analog we've been using to think about this market actually really isn't a very good one, because when you look at defence or critical national infrastructure, governments play quite a significant role in ensuring supply chain transparency, so they know what they're getting, they know where they're getting it from, and they know with confidence that they are going to be able to continue to get that for some time. For the most part, not exclusively, these are physical products. And so it's much easier to carry out that due diligence and work in a similar way. Whether that's possible to the same degree or even kind of to a lesser extent within the cyber supply chain is not 100% clear, but it's something that's being thought about across digital technology writ large. The European Union's recent Product Security Act is looking in a very similar way about the product security of digital devices kind of across the board. And so it's something that I think we need to work harder with some of you on developing technical solutions too. And we need to be careful when we're doing that as well to make sure that we're not accidentally undermining the entire way in which the industry works. By improving transparency, you might scare the bits of the industry away that we most need to work with.
Sorry.
Hello. Might be a little bit of a stupid question, but I was wondering, where does your plan fit into the other regulations, such as, for example, DORA? So I think we are watching the two sides of the same medal, if you wish. So one thing, what do the companies, the organization need to do in order to comply to such regulations? But also managing other companies' issues. So, for example, all the vulnerabilities being unwillingly produced. So, and on the other side, what you wish to do is to incentivize good behavior. So, at a certain point, I think these two things will collide into something. So my take is, where do you think you fit into the overall, let's say, regulations at the moment, and more practically, what you think you might be doing in the near future to do so, to achieve your goal?
So that's a really good question, but just really quickly, could you repeat the regulation you referenced? Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Yeah, in Europe now, there's like it's about to come into place, the DORA regulation.
Yes. So Liz, shall I have a crack at this one, and then do you want to come in with anything additional? So ultimately, the Pall Mall process is about dealing with an acute problem that's kind of got too far bad to deal with right now. And so we have looked to work with a load of international partners to figure out how we can recognize the fact that this market exists. It's not going away. Because of the financial incentives behind it, it's going to potentially increase in size quite significantly over the next few years. But we need to kind of take some acute action in order to address that. Frankly, what we haven't done the due diligence on yet is understanding exactly how that works with the broader regulatory framework happening across Europe and potentially in the US at the moment, as well as other regions of the world. We have France as a founding member of the Pall Mall process and our kind of co-lead alongside the UK. And we've been working quite closely with the European Union in this space. I think that our European partners might see these as essentially two sides of the same coin. We need to control the kind of the way in which vulnerabilities are generated, and then recognizing that there will be still some that exist, we need to control the market that exists around them as well.
I was only going to add, I think, and Ben has covered it very well, but the problem I think that we have found both in the UK and internationally to a degree with this area is that, so Ben and I work in the cyber threats team normally and in cyber policy department in the Foreign Office. So nominally we deal with just cyber. But in government and governments internationally, there is this distinction now often between cyber and tech. And I think what's difficult about this product area is it kind of falls somewhere in the middle. And so often a lot of the existing regulations or regulatory discussions that are kind of happening that are bringing all of this in, that are about kind of quote unquote tech, actually would have a kind of knock-on effect to this market, but it hasn't quite been considered. And lots of those are conversations we're kind of trying to insert ourselves into now, even though we are kind of not strictly speaking tech, but actually because sort of distinct products and supply chains and things are involved, that actually it ought to be part of those conversations as well.
We've got about 3 minutes left, so there might be time for one more question after this one.
Yeah, thank you. I have more of a foundational question about this endeavor you have. So basically, it's the case in many countries that governments usually start taking cybersecurity seriously in response to high visibility incidents instead of preventively. So my question is basically, as the UK is already doing okay in this field, what could you recommend to us as citizens in the field to get our governments to start taking cybersecurity defense seriously before high visibility incidents happen instead of in response to them?
It's a really good question. So ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, governments have been engaging with the cyber intrusion marketplace for a really long time for a whole host of different reasons. But when the UK and France have gone out to countries over the last few years or so and started to talk to them about this issue, there's been a real kind of light bulb moment of actually understanding how in turn some of the companies that they're working with could be deliberately or accidentally facilitating threat back to the UK or back to the states they're working within. And so one of the kind of jobs we've had as a policy team working as diplomats has been to try and help countries to understand what the potential threat that the misuse of these tools can mean for them as states. Everyone wants access to powerful spying tools, but no one really wants their neighbors who they don't like very much to have access to powerful cyber offensive tools that can be used back on them. And similarly, I think there's a kind of particularly acute risk around the potential for these tools to get into the criminal marketplace. If you see, as NCSC's reports highlights, the use of these tools facilitating ransomware or other sorts of cyber criminality, you see the impact and kind of scope of those attacks dramatically increasing. And so for the community, I think one of the things that we'd be really keen to kind of get from you is examples of exactly how this can turn around and cause states trouble. And that's exactly the sort of advocacy that you are all able to do as you understand this market better than us.
I think a big part of it is the awareness raising. So, I was there a couple of years ago when we in the Foreign Office particularly kind of became interested in this issue. And, frankly, one of the reasons from our side that it first kind of came to our attention was the human rights angle, all the publishing of the Pegasus papers and all of that kind of thing. And that's why, questions were coming to us about it. But NCSC were similarly looking at it from a national security perspective. And it's kind of bringing those two things together. And then for us, as working in sort of international cyber diplomacy, the knock-on effect of all of that on how the sort of wider ecosystem of international cyber behavior works. So things around norms and sort of attribution and all of those things. I think a huge part of it has just been getting this conversation out in the open, raising awareness of it generally, but also then making that argument specifically to certain states that actually this isn't just about human rights, although that is an important part of our concern, but actually there is a real national security threat for you as well, and this is why you should take this seriously.
All right, guys, we've got about 12 seconds left, so any really quick fire questions, just shout them, and we can respond with 3 sentences.
Difficult. No.
In that case, thank you all very much for joining us. Thanks so much for listening to us drone on about this issue. And we hope to engage with some of you through this process soon.